Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Not exactly. Can you now? Okay. I try to get this in just the right space. There we go. Okay. Welcome. Um, hello again. And we have a nice full crowd. This is great. I'm Kate Shawcross. I'm the director of offsite events here at PMP. And as I like to say in my other life, I do archaeology, focused on prehistoric sacred sites. So you can imagine when I saw this book, Dinner with King Tut, how rogue archaeologists are recreating sights, sounds, smells, and tastes of lost civilizations came across my desk. I was on it in a minute. But before we get started with tonight's talk, let's take care of a few household items. Please, if you would, turn off your cell phone. You don't want to be the person whose phone goes off in the middle of the talk. We have a mic here for the Q&A, and please, if you could, keep your questions short. There will be a signing line forming to my left here after the talk. And we always appreciate it if after the talk you can fold up your chairs and put them against something sturdy. That really helps the event staff. Okay, now let's dig in, pardon the pun. One of the things I love best about books, like archaeology, is that they are a wonderful means of exploration, the exploration of people, places, ideas, and whole histories unknown to us at the outset. And when it comes to what we might know about ancient cultures and civilizations, there is something, sometimes, of the written record, and there is the ever-emerging archaeological record, the bits and bones left behind. But to get a better understanding of just what it might have been like to live in those times, well, that's where the work of experimental archaeologists come in, who try to recreate life of long ago in its many dimensions. What was it really like, as best we can tell, to be those people living those lives in that time and place? To help us answer that question, our author and guide tonight is Sam Kean, a New York Times bestselling author and a two-time finalist of the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. His work has appeared in the Best American Nature and Science Writing, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Times Magazine, Psychology Today, Slate, and Mental Floss. And he has been featured on NPR's Radio Lab, All Things Considered, and Fresh Air. And joining Sam in conversation is Melissa Block, well-known and much loved in her 38 years with NPR, 12 years as host of All Things Considered. Melissa, who claims to have stumbled into radio, has gone on to rightly receive a Peabody Award, a DuPont Columbia Award, an Edward R. Murrow Award, and Professional Journalist Sigma Delta Chi Award for her reporting. Sam is in good hands. The book Dinner with King Tut has been described in a Kirkus-starred review as a fast-paced, vividly written tale that brings lost civilizations into sharp focus. Nice. Deemed by the Wall Street Journal as a deft storyteller, Mr. Kean goes a step beyond his previous books, like The Disappearing Spoon and The Ice-Pick Surgeon, with the colorful characters that filled those pages by including in Dinner with King Tut fictional narratives based on archaeological discoveries. And featured in the New York Times list of books Times readers are most excited about this summer, this book is not to be missed. So who better than to share with us just what interesting things are revealed when archaeology goes experiential? And as the first quote featured in Sam's book from author Michael Balter reads, the archaeologist is digging up not things, but people. Without further ado then, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sam Kean and Melissa Block.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a rainy night, especially. So glad to see all of you here and really excited to talk about Sam's book, which is a really exciting read and full of adventure. So Sam, why don't you start by talking about the origin story behind this? I mean, what you say you have a gripe with classical archaeology? What's the gripe?
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming out, first of all. But yeah, I had a bit of a gripe with traditional archaeology in that whenever I would go to an archaeological site, it was just a bunch of people sitting around in the dirt for hour after hour, digging out little pot shards and tossing them on a pile of other pot shards. And to me, archaeology in general is sort of one of the most exciting fields in all of science, in that it talks about like the biggest, most important questions about humankind, you know, where we came from, our origins as human beings, how we spread across the globe. And so I was really excited about archaeology to learn about it. But then I would get to the sites and it would be so dull and boring. And I just couldn't imagine how I would want to write about it, what I would write about, especially because every single site looked exactly the same, no matter what culture you were talking about. So I was just disappointed with traditional archaeology. But then I heard about experimental archaeology and got excited about it.
Experimental, experiential, I guess would be another way of describing it. So let's just review some of the experiences that you had on this journey, because your book goes from 75,000 BC in Africa up through Aztec culture in
1500s,
Mesoamerica,
yep.
With many stops in between: Egypt, Polynesia, Rome, China, trying to resurrect the past, as Kate talked about, through smell and through taste and sound. And it meant all sorts of experiments on your part. Why don't you just tick through a few of the more memorable ones of the things that you embarked on to try to recapture or recreate what times were like back then?
Yeah, few things. I attended an authentic Roman banquet, for one thing, and there was a lot of food stuff I did. I got to eat everything from caterpillars to acorns to a walrus to a lot of different things.
Not a whole walrus.
Not a whole walrus.
Okay.
I got to try a walrus.
Not
all the way. But yeah, all sorts of different unusual foods, lost recipes, things like that. I spent a day in Utah with a guy who built a giant medieval catapult. And so we spent an afternoon flinging these giant garden stones around at this wall that he had erected.
And that was in the chapter on China, right?
On China,
As
yeah.
Sort of the technology that they were using in terms of trying to defeat an enemy.
Besieging a fortress or something, you throw these giant catapult balls at it. Got to try my hand at ancient surgery. That was one of the more tedious and awful experiences in the book.
I think we should take a moment to discuss what you're talking about here. So this is a technique called trepanation, which involves cutting open a skull to relieve pressure on the brain.
Yes.
And in your case, thankfully, you were not experimenting on a live human being. You were experimenting on dead animal heads. Mm-hmm. But it was unpleasant, I think, would be a modest way of describing the experience for you. Why don't you talk about what it involved?
Yeah. This is one thing I really wanted to do with the book. I was kind of excited to do it. Trepanation is surprisingly one of the oldest surgeries, and maybe even the oldest surgery that human beings have ever done. Even though it's skull surgery, you would think that would be the last thing that they would want to operate on. But it's a very old surgery. Dates back maybe 10,000 years, so it's pretty ancient. And I talked to a few people, asked them, I was a little nervous about also asking people, where I'm going to get a head to try it out on. But I talked to this wonderful woman up in Maine who runs a school up there where they do some experimental archaeology. They teach survival skills like tanning and skinning game and stuff like that. And I wrote her kind of this nervous email and said, hey, I want to do this thing. It's kind of weird. And then immediately felt sort of bad writing the email. But she got back to me immediately. And she was like, oh, I'm game. I'm
You're
totally
coming to
down
the
for
right
this.
place.
Yeah. So she had a pig head and a deer head. And she let me try it out on this pig head and deer head. She also had stone tools made for me. So I got there, and there was a nice serrated blade for me to use, and there was an obsidian blade. And at first, it went really well, actually. The serrated blade that she had made for me was really good. It got through the skull nice and quick. I was surprised at how good it was. But then the disadvantage of stone tools, so they're sharper than you would think, stone tools. The disadvantage is that they flake pretty easily and they get dull very quickly. and we did not have backup stone tools on hand. So I spent the next about an hour and a half just sort of grinding into this skull with this very, very, like a butter knife, essentially. And it got very tedious after that. It took a very long time.
But the idea would have been, I mean, back in the day when people were using trepanation, they would have been doing it for what purpose? What were they trying to do?
If someone, you're in a war or something and someone smashed an axe down on your head and the skull was cratered in, then you would want to get the bone out of there to save their life. Or if someone had a brain bleed suddenly and you wanted to relieve pressure on the brain, you'd cut a hole in their skull, remove a bit of it, and save their life, essentially.
Wonder if anybody is worried about their dinner right now. There's a lot of the book that is quite fragrant, would be one way of describing it. You mentioned tanning, deer hide, the liquid at the same place in Maine where Moose Ridge is where you learn to tan deer hide, which turned out to be a really difficult procedure. Took a huge amount of upper body strength, it sounds like, to actually wring out
more than I
the
had.
deer.
Yes.
More than you had.
Yes. So that was another project I wanted to do, was to tan a deer hide, essentially. So a big, full deer hide. And the way people did it way back when was they used the brains of the animal to do it. So you have to work some sort of material in there to prevent decay, keep it nice and supple. And brain was what they used back then. So the woman who runs it, her son actually was kind of a professional tanner. And he got a deer hide and he got the brains. And so we spent a long afternoon working it in. You put it up on a rack, you have to wring it out, put it back in, soak it in, get it worked in there again. Just hour after hour after hour of that. It was hot there, and there were flies all over, and they were biting me, and it was sweating, and it was just a miserable, miserable afternoon. But I think that's actually it was one of the more valuable experiences in that, there's a lot of fun stuff like getting to eat and hear and see really cool things, but it taught me a lot about the emotions. I think that was an important part of it, just about how frustrating a lot of simple things were back then. Just making a bit of clothing took hours and hours. And I was really, really annoyed. Or doing a surgery to try to save someone's life. It was not easy. It took hours and hours. And so that frustration really drove home how difficult life was back then. And I think we all know that obviously on some level, but to experience it, to have your arms cramping up, to be wiping the sweat away and the flies biting, I think really drove it home in a way that just reading about it couldn't really get across.
Right. You've brought something with you today. This was an experiment you undertook.
Yes. Is it time for it?
I think it's time for it.
Okay.
This was in spinning off of the chapter on Egypt when you're talking about mummification. And why don't you just tell us what you've got in your hands there?
Yeah, so in the book, I talked to someone who made an actual human mummy in modern times, but I wanted to try it on my own. So I made a fish mummy here. I bought this a couple summers ago. It was a whole fish I got. And, we've all been in D.C. in the summer, obviously. Pretty nasty out, pretty muggy. This has never seen the inside of a refrigerator. And fish are not known for lasting or keeping very long, but it's perfectly well preserved. I have not opened it in a while, but we're going to open it up now and see what it looks like.
Do you need both hands? I would hold your mic. Okay. Now, it also had linen around it. This is burlap, it looks like, yeah?
Yeah, something.
And a red snapper, if anyone's interested in the particular.
It's going to take me a little bit. I got very into winding this up.
Well, while you're doing that, why don't you tell us what's involved in mummifying a red snapper?
In mummifying, it's a lot easier process than I would have figured. Essentially, you just take a mineral called natron, which is a mix of baking soda and salt, and I put down a layer of that in a casserole dish, and then put the fish on top of that, and then cover it up with more natron. And that's pretty much all you have to do. And that's basically the process they used in ancient times as well to mummify people, was they just put a lot of natron on them and dried them out.
So it just absorbs?
It absorbs
basically?
water, prevents bacteria from getting in there. So
and there she is.
this is the fish. So It turned out pretty well.
Does it smell? Tiny bit fishy.
Tiny bit. It would be like if you boiled a fish for way too long, like dial that odor down maybe 10 or 15 times. It's a very weak odor, but a little fishy, but it's in pretty good shape overall.
There she is.
Yep.
She is.
An experiment you can do at home. It's very, very easy. So.
I think the other thing that surprised me, well, one of many in the book, is that it was not hard for you to find people who are doing these things to show you how to do them. I wouldn't necessarily have thought of people building a Roman road to recreate what that experience was like, or baking ancient Egyptian bread, all these things that you did. So it sounds like there's a community of people who are actively engaged in these pursuits.
Yeah, it's a bit of a scattered community.
Yeah.
Some of them are, professional archaeologists who they did traditional archaeology, but they just wanted to connect with their favorite culture on a different level, so they wanted to try some experiments, or they realized there was no way to get the information they wanted unless they did some experiments. In other cases, it's sort of amateurs, even kind of screwball amateurs who got really obsessed with something and just dedicate all their free time to doing this. I talked to some people like that. And in other cases, a lot of the people involved with this field aren't professional scientists or archaeologists at all. There's a lot of indigenous people who are either preserving their culture or trying to revive certain aspects of their culture. And in a lot of cases, they are the ones who are teaching the archaeologists or correcting the archaeologists on how things were way back when. They have the knowledge encoded in lore that they have, maybe even songs and poems and things like that. So it isn't a unified field, but that's kind of one of the fun things about it, was that insight could really come from anywhere.
Yeah. What is the attitude of traditional archaeologists toward the experimental, experiential archaeology that you're describing? I mean, are they skeptical? Do they think it's a bunch of hoo-ha? What kinds of attitudes would you say you encountered along the way?
I think there is some skepticism among sort of traditional, especially academic archaeologists. And I think there's different reasons for that. Some of it, I think, is just sort of inertia, and this is the way we've done things for a long time, and this is the way we want to keep doing them. And they're a little suspicious of people doing things in labs or, trying to recreate things. And some of it, I think, is warranted skepticism in that you can do bad experimental archaeology, just like you can do a bad experiment in any field. And so they're right that you'd have to be careful about what you're doing. One good example of that was the guy who made bread. Name was Seamus Blackley. Actually invented the Xbox gaming system. That's kind of his claim to fame. But then went to a different job, decided he wanted to learn how to make ancient breads. He made medieval bread, and then he got involved with making Egyptian bread. And he tried to make his first round of Egyptian bread, went on Twitter, and posted a bunch of pictures, and he got absolutely rocked on Twitter. Everyone said, "You have no idea what you're doing. This is a terrible job. You're stupid. What are you talking about?" And he decided, you know what? They are right. I didn't know what I was doing. And so he decided he was going to do a good job with it. He flew over to Egypt with microbiology equipment. He sampled some ancient pots and molds they had to get the yeast. He sourced heirloom grains. He sourced the wood that they would have used. He built a fire pit in his backyard. He really went all out to make this bread. And then I got to visit him in LA, and he gave me some of this bread. And it was probably the most delicious bread I've ever had in my life. It was absolutely incredible. It was sort of a whole wheat sourdough kind of thing with coriander in it. And so, yeah, there's people who do bad experiments, but in some cases they learn from them and they do good experiments as well.
And you mentioned how native cultures might be imparting knowledge to the people who are trying to recreate or to learn about ancient traditions. What are some of those? I mean, you went to Alaska, for example, to some native communities there.
Yeah, in Alaska. So when I was in Alaska, I learned how to render seal blubber into oil. That was one of the big things we did there. Another really good example is navigation. So Polynesian and Micronesian navigation. They found all these islands in the middle of the ocean. I mean, hundreds of miles between islands. You cannot see them from one island. And I think there was a general sense that they must have sort of stumbled into them. A storm blew them off course and they just got lucky and they landed on these islands. But no, they really knew what they were doing, how to navigate, how to read signs from waves, water, birds, clouds, all these things. So that's another good example of the people who had the knowledge kind of correcting what archaeologists, the assumptions that they were making.
Yeah. One of the last chapters in the book involves an ancient Aztec sport called Ulama. And having read your description of it, I had a pretty good idea in my head of what it involved, but I did go and watch some videos of people who are doing it actively now in Mexico City, and it hurt just to look at the videos. I mean, it looked like unbelievably painful. So why don't you explain? Ulama is a ball game in which you are only allowed to advance the ball with your hip, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So you play it on a flat surface. In Mexico City, we played it on this concrete plaza that they had there. And yeah, you can only hit the ball with your hip. So that's the only legal move, is to hit the ball with your hip. And what really surprised me about it was how heavy the ball was. It's made out of rubber. It bounces really, really well. But we were playing with, it was either an 11 or 12 pound ball. And they can go up to 15 pounds. So imagine taking a bowling ball, essentially, putting some padding on it, but knocking that around with your hip. So that's the game.
But not just vertically. So that's one thing when the ball is in the air. When the ball is on the ground, it's a whole other operation, because you have to get down to the ground to get the ball only with your hip.
Right, yeah. So when it's bouncing around, it was actually fun. I was a little gun shy at first. The guy who was teaching me, he told me the motion was, he said, just do a Shakira. You just take your hip and you punch it out like that. And so that kind of made sense. I was kind of thinking about that. And it was fun while it was bouncing around. But a heavy ball like that loses momentum pretty quickly. And when it's rolling along on the ground, you can only hit it with your hip. So you have to drop down to the ground, kind of throw your hand down, drop to the pavement, and then use your hip like a ping pong ball paddle and knock it back. And then you have to get up right away, because it's a penalty if you don't get up before it gets to the other team. Then they knock it back, and usually they would knock it at me. And then I would have to drop down again, hit it back with my hip, then pop up over and over and over.
And you have some protection, but not a ton.
Yeah, so there was this leather girdle they gave me, and essentially I just sat there and jumped up and down while they kind of squeezed me into this leather girdle. It's mostly covering your hip area so it doesn't bruise after you're hitting this ball a bunch of times.
Well, why don't you go ahead? You have a section from your book where you're describing what it was like after you had some practice runs to start in a match.
Yeah, I'm going to read a short section here. And I think the only other thing you have to know, we were playing a game, it was like 3 or 4 on a side. And there were a few players that were on the various teams, like a dentist, a psychologist, a physical therapist. And the physical therapist's daughter was actually also playing. This 11-year-old was playing as well. So after the practice runs, speaking of which, however unprepared, I'm soon thrust into the match the others are playing. I'm told to choose which team I want to join. Classic playground torment. I glance back and forth, cringing with the knowledge that whichever team I pick will likely lose. Cravenly, I select the side with the 11-year-old child, hoping that she will shoulder some of the blame. In the version of the game we're playing, you score points by knocking the ball past your opponent's end line. I quickly realize that this style of the ball game is really 2 sports in one, depending on whether the ball is bouncing or not. When it is, it's a madcap combination of soccer and tennis. You're constantly trying to wrong foot your opponents by knocking the ball at strategic angles and making them scurry side to side. Finally, you punch the ball in for a score. It's fast, fun, and dynamic. Unfortunately, when the ball loses momentum and starts rolling along the ground, the game deteriorates into Wide World of Sports as presented by Dante. Again, you can only return the ball with your hip, which means throwing yourself to the ground over and over. Imagine doing 100 burpees in a row, except every time you drop, you have to hip punch a bowling ball the other direction. My thighs begin quaking from all the up and down, and my already poor form deteriorates into flailing. I feel like somebody trying to play hockey without knowing how to ice skate. My legs are soon so shot that I can't even enjoy the aerial gameplay. The other team is also now putting weird English on the ball, spinning it like pool sharks. This throws off the timing of my Shakira thrusts. One time the ball slams into my shin. Another time it blasts my rib cage. When it smacks my quad once, I crumple like a sniper took me out. Shamefully, I spend the last half of the game hiding behind the 11-year-old and letting her return shots that were meant for me. In my defense, she is far better than me. She's fearless and agile. I have never before felt like the proverbial little league right fielder, silently begging the other team not to hit the ball my way, making irresponsible promises to God. But that's what the Aztec ballgame has reduced me to.
How did you feel the next day?
I felt worse the next day,
Yeah.
actually, yes. I was in Mexico City to see some archaeology and things, and every time I saw a staircase, I winced because my legs ached and ached and ached for days after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But these are folks who are trying to reclaim their history in a sense, yeah?
Yeah, definitely. These are people who heard about the game, know about it. And essentially what happened was when the Spanish came in and conquered the Aztecs, they banned the game as subversive because it's related to the Aztecs' religion. But it always survived in rural pockets. They kind of kept it alive for centuries and centuries in these rural areas. And now it's starting to make its way back into the cities. And the people I talked to were reviving it there.
Let's talk a little bit about the format of the book, because along with the history and the recreations that you're doing experiments to recreate, you have woven in fictional stories, as Kate mentioned. With each chapter, there's a character and set in that time and some ordeal that character is going through. How did you come to that construct? What do you think it lends to the book?
One thing I like about experimental archaeology is how sensory rich it is. You know, you get to taste things and feel things and hear things. And I knew that there would be times when I was experiencing those, and I thought those would be kind of rich and good for the book, but I wanted it to be as immersive as possible. And because it's about archaeology, you know, people in ancient times, I did want you to feel like you were there in a lot of cases. And fiction can just do a better job of that in a lot of circumstances because you're in a character's point of view, seeing things from their point of view, going through a day the way they would have. So I chose to have the chapters kind of alternate back and forth between fictional sections where a character does something, gets into some trouble, or does something ill-advised, and then sort of stops. I go into talking about my experiences related to what they were doing, why they were doing it, stuff like that, and it kind of bounces back and forth between those. But the basic idea was just to make it as immersive as possible. Right.
It's its own sort of dive that you could do to get into that time period and into the head of someone at that time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Were there any experiences that you were hoping to have or things you were trying to uncover that just eluded you? You couldn't find a way to learn them or somebody to help guide you through them?
One thing I wish I'd been able to do, there was a chapter about Polynesia and about their navigation. And I got to go out in a boat for a little bit there and do some of that. I really wish I'd been able to get onto an open ocean voyage in one of those boats where, you know, it's a 2 or 3 day voyage. They're navigating by the stars, using waves and birds and things like that. So I really wish I'd been able to get out on something like that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, the day you did go out, I think you had no wind, right?
There was no wind, yes. So
for a very long time.
Yeah, and it worked. It kind of ended up benefiting the chapter in some ways because that's what happens to the characters. They end up stuck somewhere. They don't know where land is, and I could pour all the frustration into the characters. Mm-hmm. So,
were there times when you felt like I'm cosplaying without the costume? I'm just sort of acting as much as I can, but I sort of my my sphere of knowledge is only going to get me so far.
In some ways, yeah, but there were experts out there who knew more than I did. So I could go talk to them. And sort of, I mean, floundering around is a good way to learn, I think. So in the cases when I did feel like I was floundering around, I felt like I learned a lot about those things. You know, if I had tried to make a stone tool and it just made it perfectly the first time, that probably wouldn't be that interesting. I don't know if I could impart how, again, frustrating it was, or how baffling it was, or how, in some ways, how ingenious people were way back then to have figured all this stuff out. I think we sort of discount how sophisticated the technology was way back then.
Yeah. Just a couple more things, and we're happy to field some questions. So if you want to start lining up at the microphone, you might want to do that now. Were you, when you were involved in these ancient traditions and these times, sort of transporting yourself back, were you dreaming in those times? Were you, like, in your dreams finding yourself in ancient Egypt or on an Aztec ball field?
I mean, there were definitely moments, especially after I was sore and aching, when I would get up and have like flashbacks, definitely.
But not in your dream life.
Not so much in my dream life. I mean, I was sort of immersed in it all day,
Right.
and then but definitely flashbacks with the pain and the soreness.
Yeah. We have a couple folks lined up. Why don't we go to questions? Go ahead.
Okay. In your study, in your travels, the Aztec game made me think of this. I've seen some art from Greece where young men would have a bull charging at them, and they would time it so they would leap over the back of the bull. And I'm wondering if you saw that, if you could say a few words about it, because I've never forgotten it, and I've been mystified how they did it.
That I believe it was on Crete, I think.
believe it was Crete,
yeah,
too.
on Crete they do that. And there's big, beautiful frescoes there where they just jump over bulls that are charging at them.
They
Yeah.
just do a somersault over
Yeah, if you did a flip, you got extra points, I think, for doing that. But I mean, people run with the bulls today in Spain, so not
running.
quite as dangerous. But teenagers, they like to do silly things.
Maybe add it to the paperback version.
Yeah.
Next time.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I have two very short, I think, brief questions, which I'll do. In your disappointing experience with ocean navigating, certainly as you described it, I thought of the Kon-Tiki and Thor Heyerdahl.
Mm-hmm.
Has he looked on in the field as a sort of early person in the field, or a founder of the field? That's one question.
Yeah.
I can give you both of them at the same time, and you can.
Okay, I can answer that one quick. Kon-Tiki was his famous experiment that someone did in 1947. Essentially, he sailed essentially a balsa wood raft, I think, from South America over to Polynesia on the theory that that's how Polynesia was colonized, how they found all the islands.
Right.
I think he's appreciated for the fact that he was bold enough to do the experiment and that they survived the experiment,
Right.
frankly. But his theory has pretty much fallen apart completely. So I think there is an appreciation of the spirit, but the data just contradicts that whole
Right,
thing.
right.
Yeah.
The other one is probably even a smaller question, and that is in the game of Aztec hip soccer. You mentioned that when the European invaders came, they didn't like it. They banned it because it was associated with the Aztec religion. How is the hip soccer game associated with the Aztec religion?
They saw the ball as the sun, and they had to keep the ball moving at all times, just like the sun needed to keep moving in the sky at all times. And they would do it during religious festivals and things like that. And the infamous thing about the game was that the losers sometimes got sacrificed in their religious rites. So my team won, so that's why I'm here.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Sam, you mentioned good experiments and bad experiments. And when we read your books or listen to the podcast, we hear these stories and think, oh my gosh, that's crazy stuff. But then you explain that it wasn't necessarily crazy because at the time, those people were conventional science folks and they were probably following the accepted scientific method of the time, even though we may look at that as barbaric. But it just occurred to me as you're talking, when people look back on today, we've got people in science who are not following any science methods, who are sort of anti-science. I'm talking about federal government science positions here. And I'm just wondering what you think historians of a couple decades from now might say about science of today.
There's two questions there. There's about the actual science, and then there's sort of the infrastructure around the science and supporting it and things like that. I hope they don't look on the era right before this as sort of a golden age, and this was the beginning of the end. But these cuts are deep, and they are not only hurting scientists now, they're undermining the future. Being able to attract talent, a lot of institutional knowledge that can disappear as well. So. Nervous. I think the science itself is good, but I hope there's, or I fear that there might be, we might be undermining sort of the conditions that make it possible in the future as well.
Viola.
In your research, have you ever explored or come across kind of how the language or methods of communication that was used, kind of how that would have impacted their lives in different civilizations?
I've done a little bit of that. I'm actually working on another book now that maybe talks about that a little bit more. And I went to Peru recently, and I did an article about what are called the quipus. The Inca Empire recorded information on strings by tying knots into the strings. So it's a really unusual way to written language, essentially, instead of clay tablets or papyrus or whatever. So that and the new book I'm working on kind of gets a little bit more into that. This one, a little less so than that.
Thank you.
Hey, so were there any practices or techniques that have been lost or forgotten that you actually were like, that's actually really smart. We should bring that back?
Ooh, the foods were good, so definitely that, yeah. One thing I was surprised about was how good the stone tools were. Obsidian, especially, it's a black glassy rock. You can get obsidian sharper than a modern steel scalpel. It's extremely, extremely sharp. It has some disadvantages, but I was surprised at how good it was. So that one, and I think the navigation techniques were really fascinating. Just being able to, the way they could look at birds and the waves and just be like, land is that way, and being able to read those things really, it's almost like a superpower, magic power walking around. So
Bring back obsidian. That's the lesson, you think?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, you've written many books from chemistry to neurobiology. How do you decide what you're going to write about next? Is it just on a whim what you find curious?
That's a little bit of it. This book, for instance, I'd probably been gathering information for it for 7 or 8 years, I think. But yeah, that's the long and the short of it. When it comes time to write a new book, I have sort of a file that I go look through that says, here's a bunch of things I think are interesting. They're kind of related. Maybe I could talk about that. Then I go talk with my agent, talk with my publishing house, and just try to kind of find a good topic. And sometimes they say, nope, don't like that idea. And I have to go back to the drawing board. Or sometimes they're like, yeah, that sounds great. Let's go with that one.
What are you thinking about writing next?
I am working on a book that will be coming out probably late next year about the greatest lost treasures in history. So that will be, I mentioned the languages, so lost languages, some actual lost treasures, lost species, lost bones, lost civilizations, all sorts of things like that.
Earlier you said that was it just a joke when you said people who lost the game got sacrificed?
Oh, was that just a joke that they got sacrificed if they lost the
Did
game?
they? And if so, why were they playing the game? I mean,
You make a good point.
That is an excellent question.
It was not a joke. They did not happen every time, but there were certain times when people lost and they were sacrificed. Sometimes they were captives, so they would wage a war, they would get captives, and they would have to play each other. And so they were sort of forced to play the game, and at least if you played the game, you had a chance to win and save your life. And there are theories, I don't know if anything's been proven about this, but in some cases, so the basic point of making a sacrifice for the Aztec was that if you spilled some blood, it would keep the sun alive for another day. So it might have been sort of an honor in some cases to be sacrificed because you were keeping everyone alive for another day after that. So that's one theory.
Why would you need more than one people to be sacrificed then?
If it was a big feast day or something like that, or maybe they would string them out over a few days.
Okay.
Thanks for the question.
For the books, how did you research the smells?
A lot of that came with just doing the experiments, and I would notice what I was smelling while I was doing it. One that still, this isn't so much a dream, but I can kind of still smell this, is the deer hide. When I was tanning that, it had this kind of off crab odor, like crab that had gone a little bad. I don't know why that was, but that is one that really stuck out to me as sort of a strange, unusual smell. But it was just coming, the things would happen in the course of doing the experiments.
Thank you.
This may be sort of an ancillary question related to your book, but I've often wondered, and perhaps you have too, it seems like there were these advanced civilizations in Central America, Mexico, Peru, but North America, which to me it seems like it'd be much more favorable for those civilizations to have developed there. It didn't really happen. And Central America and south of that is where it happened. Do you have any explanation, or have you ever wondered why?
I think archaeologists are reviving that assumption a little bit. There was the mound building culture, for instance.
But obviously that wouldn't compare to, say, Teotihuacan or something.
I mean, some of those mounds are as big as the pyramids in Egypt. I mean, they're pretty impressive. So I think they would probably revive that assumption, or maybe we just haven't found evidence yet. In the Amazon, for instance, they're finding some huge, huge cities and things down there. As for North America, I don't know. Maybe it was just sort of random luck that it happened to be in a few places where it arose, and had time gone on and the contact had not happened. Maybe North America right now would be the sort of hotspot of where the sort of great classic civilizations arose. It could have just been random luck.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So now that you have a mummified fish, what are your plans next for it? What do you do with a mummified fish?
It's been sitting on my counter since I made it, and I'm going to wrap it up and probably put it back there. Just a little decoration.
I don't know that there's much you can do with a mummified fish. I don't know.
Can you tell us, thank you very much, by the way, and can you tell us what else King Tut ate?
King Tut. So the premise of that section was to talk about bread and beer, which are sort of the staples of the Egyptian diet. The workers who built the pyramids got paid in bread and beer. That was their wages, bread and beer. And even the hieroglyphs for meal or sustenance was sort of a combo of bread and beer. So that's how important they were to their civilization. Some other things, the guy I talked to, Seamus Blackley, who made the bread, he apologized that he did not have, I think he said he was going to cook up some leeks in beef tallow, was going to be the topping for the bread. And he apologized that he didn't have time to make them for me, but the bread needed no topping. It was that good. So that's another thing they would have had. And the beer I made was with, I'm trying to remember the ingredients now. I think some coriander, some cinnamon was in there. One thing that really differentiated that beer was that it had no hops in it. So it didn't have the bitter overtones that modern beer does. It's actually much more sour, more like a kombucha, actually, than a traditional beer, which kind of made sense to me in some way because it was really hot there a lot of the time, and sour can help quench your thirst. So having that flavor, I think, would have made a lot of sense.
Having done that, Sam, brewed your own beer and tried to recreate ancient beer, does it feel like cheating now if you just pop open a Sierra Nevada or something?
No, because I can do that right away. It doesn't take me weeks and months
Yeah.
to do that. Yeah.
But it came out well. You loved your beer, right?
It was good. Yeah.
Hi, and I do apologize in advance for anyone who's eating after this. So my question is, when it came to the tanning process and the use of the brains, how were the brains prepared to be used? Were they chopped up, blended, like purified, or pureed a little bit, or were you literally taking a brain and just going like over and over and over until it gradually disintegrated?
My fingers were the whisk and the tool there. We put them in a bucket, put some water in there. They added some egg yolk to get a little more fat in there, and then I sat there and ground them up, and tried to break up all the strings and stuff in there, and then just dumped the deer hide in and started working it. So there wasn't a lot of preparation or anything like that.
Okay, and quick follow-up. Did they tell you anything about the process of how people came to the conclusion that brains were a good assistant to tanning leather?
No, I think they realized they needed fat, and brains have a lot of fat in them. My guess is, this is spitballing, but my guess is, maybe some brain or fat spilled on, they would have used just basically rawhide or let a hide turn hard. Maybe they noticed some fat spilled on it from brain or something, and it was a little more supple, different quality. And so they started experimenting, working on it, and realized that fats are a good source. Sort of the folklore among people who tan is that every animal has exactly enough brain to tan its own hide. That's the theory.
Thank you.
You asked.
You asked, yes.
So not a food question, although the mummified fish does look a lot like my dad's favorite type of Chinese preserved fish, which you do see in Chinatown. So,
okay.
Yeah, but you have to rehydrate it. So my question is, through your research of ancient cultures and and through archaeology, what's one thing that you've learned that you use to view through the lens with which you view current society or your current life day to day that you might not have had you not studied these ancient cultures?
One thing I've noticed is that when I walk around, I guess before I would just see trees and it'd be like this sort of vague green canopy overhead. It was pleasant and all, but I didn't pay much attention to them. Now I see the acorns down there, and that's potential food. Or you see the branches, those are potential tools. Or even rocks that you see lying around underfoot, those can be tools as well. So just being a little more aware that there are resources essentially in your environment, and that back then people wouldn't have taken a stroll through nature. I'm sure they enjoyed it, but they were also looking for things and trying to find tools in them. So that kind of opened my eyes up a little bit.
Great. Sorry, one last thing. So if you could have lived in any of the cultures that you feature in this book, if you had to choose one, which one would it be? For better or for worse?
Egypt has the bread.
Egypt did have good bread, and Rome too would have been cool. I cannot think of anything cooler, though, than being on those Polynesian ships and getting to an island that no human being has ever seen before or set foot on. Just an absolute paradise, and stepping offshore, and that is your home from now on. I think that would be an amazing experience.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Anybody else? That's a great place to end, actually. I like the image of you just landing on that shore.
Golden shore? Okay,
on that
yeah.
golden shore. Sam Kean, thank you so much for talking about Dinner with King Tut.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.